What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another video. In the last episode of the axle build video series, we installed the Yukon gear sets. We went from 410 to 513s. It's going to match our tire size perfectly, running 37, so we are good to go on gears. Now, in this episode, we're going to take a look at beefing up our front axle. We're going to be welding on a truss, C gussets, and some lower control arm skid plates. This is really going to strengthen up our front axle and handle, those bigger tires a little bit better. So let's get this video started. So let's go ahead and take a look at the truss, what it comes with. Now, I went with the 7-slot customs truss designed for the JL and JT. This is a very low-cost upgrade. This is probably one of the cheapest axle upgrades you can do. The truss itself, which consists of these 3 pieces, is $80. Super cheap, plus using the code JKGear on the 7-slot customs website, an additional 10% off. So we did not stop just at the truss. We are installing their C gussets as well. We're also going to install some lower control arm skid plates. These are going to really beef up the brackets. The factory Jeep brackets aren't the strongest, and they do hang down there pretty low. These are from Clayton Offroad. They're going to be really easy to weld on. I'm excited to get all this together. So let's go back a second and talk about why you might need to add a truss on your axle. Trusses. They are one of the best ways to add some strength and rigidity into your front or rear axle. Now, how do you know when you need to do a truss and if you should? Pretty much my suggestion is if you are retaining your factory Jeep axle and you're going with bigger tire sizes and you really want to get into more off-roading, I'd highly recommend a truss. They're really cheap insurance and it's really going to strengthen up our factory axle. Now, when I'm saying strengthen up our axle, it does not change anything internally. It's only kind of reinforcing the external or the whole housing rigidity. So let's go ahead and mock up this truss. I'll show you what each piece is going to strengthen, how it strengthens it, and kind of limitations of a truss in general. So let's go ahead and pop this on. So I very roughly mocked up this truss, but it's definitely enough to show you guys how a truss works and what it does. So the entire idea behind a truss is to prevent these tubes from bending up off-road. The larger tires are going to put a lot of leverage on this long axle tube as well as over here. It's also going to tie this entire piece kind of into one. We're going to weld the truss onto our center housing because normally this entire length of tube is held on by a few plug welds over here on the cast center section. Once you add large tires, there's a lot of torque on this axle, and we don't want to rip that tube out of the housing. So the truss is going to weld all along up here on the bottom, up on the top of this cast section, as well as on this side. So it really reinforces the whole thing and makes it one solid unit. Now, there's gonna be a few tricks welding to this cast center section versus just the steel tubes, and we'll talk about that later in this video. Now, a big concern on the new JL and JT axles is this FAD center section. So this is the front axle disconnect, and it's not a solid tube. Right here is another cast piece of steel that is plug welded to the short tube and the tube on the outside. This externally can be a big failure point. It's not too strong, but by adding a truss along here and welding it all the way along here. Sorry, I didn't mean to flick you guys off. It's going to really reinforce this FAD system and the entire axle itself. So we're not really beefing up anything internally. It's all external. It's going to prevent these tubes from bending, from spinning, and it's just really going to strengthen it up. Now, another really big concern with larger tires is our C's, our axle C's. These things right here, on the JT and JL, they're beefed up a little bit, but the older model, JKs, XJs, TJs, all those, this C right here is very, very flimsy, kind of small, and when you add a lot of big tire leverage to it, these have a tendency to bend. That's going to give you some negative camber, and that is unfixable without adjustable ball joints or a new axle housing. So the easiest way to strengthen these up is to weld some C gussets that fit right up in here, and it really strengthens it up a lot. Now, I can't mock this one up yet because we're gonna have to remove a bunch of stuff in here prior to welding it, but hopefully you get the idea. Now, for the lower control arm skid plates, all they do is weld on right to here. Now, you're probably wondering, Ben, does that actually add any strength, or is it just a skid plate so you don't mess up your control arms? It is a nice strength upgrade for a few reasons. We're boxing this bracket in, so it's a lot stronger. Instead of just having a weld up here and a weld up here, and these can kind of bend over, it welds it all up into one box, and it does become a lot stronger. These are, once again, really cheap and very easy to do. Now, you can probably tell that the Jeep is already halfway assembled. It's already up on a lift, so we're practically ready to start this project. But if you want to do this at home, it's going to make it a little harder. If you don't have a lift, you're still going to have to disconnect everything up front here. So our track bar, our steering, our sway bar links, take all that off and try to jack up your Jeep as high as you can and lower the axle. We want to make sure we have plenty of room in here to grind, to weld. We're really going to have to get deep up into this axle. If you don't really have that much room to work with, pull your axle out, put it on a cart and weld it somewhere else, or take it somewhere to get welded. Or you can take it to a shop, and I think standard labor rates is probably gonna be a 2-3 hour job. So it'd probably be about $300 to get this welded in. But is it worth it? I'd say yes. So that is enough talking. Let's go ahead and prep and get this truss and gussets ready to be installed. Before we go ahead and start welding this on, there's gonna be a lot of prep work we need to do. Like I already mentioned, we gotta remove everything so we have good access. We're gonna go ahead and test fit our truss to make sure everything sits level and doesn't have really any gaps where we're gonna weld onto our tubes. There's a little gap right here, so we might have to grind down a little bit on the housing or the truss itself. It's pretty common to have a little bit of grinding just due to the fact that every axle is gonna have slight variations. What we're also gonna do is go ahead and mark where we are gonna grind the paint and kind of prep the metal for welding. With all the areas marked with the paint pen, we can go ahead and remove our truss. Now that we know the truss fits good, I like to paint the inside with a little bit of Steel-It. Once this is welded on, it's gonna be really hard to paint the inside of that truss. And we don't want rust just running all over our axle and looking like complete crap. So what I'm gonna do is hit the inside with a good few coats of Steel-It. It's a weldable paint. That way, if we do get a little bit of paint on the edges, we can just weld right over it. So I'm gonna go ahead, test fit the other pieces. If they fit, paint them all with some Steel-It. So at this point, we have everything prepped. The truss fits nice. It's cleaned up, it's ready to be welded. First thing we wanna make sure we do is disconnect our battery up there. Both negative and positive, go ahead and disconnect it. Make sure everything fits nice, there's nothing in the way. Tack the truss in a few spots, and then we're gonna start off welding this right here, weld this piece to this piece, and then slowly alternate welding different seams. So we'll come over here, weld this seam, go over to the back, weld the opposite seam. Come over here, weld here, vice versa, and keep bouncing around the axle. Now the spots where we're gonna weld to the cast, we're gonna have to preheat it. So we're gonna grab a can of MAP gas, heat up the cast, make the weld, and then do a small amount of post-heat treatment as well. Let's do it. All right, so I got the truss all welded in. The big thing is that on the cast section, so the center diff and over here on the FAD, just hit it with some preheat with the MAP gas, heat it up, make your weld, let it cool for like 20-30 seconds, and come back with the MAP gas and reheat it, you know, every so often, about every minute, just heat it back up. If you hear a loud ting, it means the weld it cracked. And that's because the cast and steel cool at different rates, and your weld just cracks. So really try to prevent that by pre and post heat, but it's really, there's nothing to it. And then when we're making our welds across the axle, we're just doing real small sections and alternating. So that is done. We're gonna let that cool off before we paint it. Now it's time to move over to the C gussets. So these are gonna be really, really easy. On the JKs, you do have to be really careful of welding on your C gussets. You don't wanna blow out your factory ball joints. Most of those have like a plastic insert in them. On the JLs, I was talking with Eric over there, and he said it's really, there's a lot more metal up here, so it can kind of disperse the heat. Plus these C gussets don't go all the way up here on, on the JLs and JTs. They're not hugging the ball joint near as much. So we're still gonna take care and only do, this section and right here, probably in 2 sections, let each side cool. That way we don't overheat this ball joint and blow it out. But we did the same thing, we test fitted it. It has this little cutout for the ABS wire bracket. Went ahead and removed that, marked where we're gonna grind down and clean up the axle. I'm also gonna try to hit this in some so we can get that bolt all the way through. But we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna clean it up and weld both our upper and lower C gusset in. So as you can tell, it's really not that hard to weld this on, but doing this on the ground would really suck. The best way to do it is either on a lift or pull the axle out completely. That way you just have, you can move the axle around, weld wherever you want, or just take it to a shop. I think most shops are gonna charge, $200-300 to weld this on. And I mean, it's taken me about 3 hours so far, so it's probably worth it. And plus, if you don't have a welder, then you're kind of out of luck. So definitely take it to a reputable off-road shop to get your truss and everything welded on. That way it's getting done correctly, they're not welding something wrong, the procedure's correct, and you're gonna have a good outcome. But it's definitely looking really good. We have truss, gussets. All we have left to do is the control arm skid plates. We're gonna weld those on right now and call this job done. Last but not least, we're gonna go ahead and spray paint it all. So just like that, our axle housing is now beefed up and ready for some big tires. As you can tell, it's really not too difficult. Yes, I mean, it's pretty labor intensive, a lot of grinding, a lot of welding, and overall you have to know what you're doing. It's not bad though. If you don't know how to weld, take it to a shop. It's worth it to get, kind of the peace of mind to run bigger tires on your factory axle housing. There's other ways to do it. A lot of people will use sleeves, which are pretty much piece of metal that slide inside the tubing to increase that the wall thickness. However, on the JLs and JTs, you cannot sleeve them due to the fact that this has a CAD. Now on a JK and other model Jeeps like TJs and stuff, you can sleeve them. The only issue with sleeving them is that you still have weak points right here where the sleeve doesn't go all the way through the axle, whereas the truss reinforces it all the way. We're welded to the cast, to the axle tube, all over, and it really strengthens it up. Personally, I'm a bigger fan of trusses than a sleeve. If you do want to do both for some reason, you can. There's nothing wrong with doing sleeves and a truss. It's just another layer of expense where I'd honestly just recommend a truss. So this job is done. We are painted. All we have to do is pretty much put everything back together, but I'm not going to put everything back together yet because we still have more upgrades to do while we're here at Offroad Elements. So a few other things let's talk about real quick. The C gussets. The C gussets are a major upgrade. If I was to choose between a truss or C gussets, I would choose the C gussets first. On pretty much all Jeep factory axles, the axle C is pretty thin and it is prone to bending. You go over a big bump, hard drop off. When you're running a bigger tire, that's a lot more leverage on that, and it could easily bend it, and then your whole housing is scrap. So the C's are even cheaper. I think these were about $60. The truss was 80. I think these were like $30. So we are into this maybe 150, maybe $200 for a complete strong axle housing. Now you're probably wondering, Ben, what about the rear? Why are you not beefing up the rear? On the Gladiator, it's not exactly needed. It uses, I think it's like 10 millimeters thicker than the JL Rubicon 44. So the axles are really beefed up. The wall thickness is plenty strong. And who knows, maybe in the future I will add a truss, but I just don't see the need for it right now. We're not doing anything too crazy, and the rear's already beefed up from the factory, so that's good to go. But on your other models, your JKs, your JLs, it's gonna be the same process as the front. We're gonna weld the truss on, and you're good to go. The Gladiator though, not really needed. So axle housing upgrades, we are done. Thank you guys for watching. Stay tuned for the next video where we are doing some more major axle upgrades. See you guys later.